I made a video recently in which I essentially said that parallel Bibles, to me, are rather useless or at best cumbersome to use. But here is a situation, a certain type of parallel Bible that I think can be very useful indeed. Hello again. Today we're going to look at a type of parallel Bible that I think is useful and maybe essential for Bible study, and that is gospel parallels. So it is not parallel translations of the Bible side by side, but parallel gospel accounts in the same translation. So one can compare and contrast how the different gospel writers recorded a particular event in the gospel story. Focus this in a little bit. And this was, I guess, brought to mind as a subject for a video based on a couple of things. In today's lectionary reading in the gospel this morning, the day I'm recording this, we read the Gospel of John chapter 6, which has a couple of things in it. One, it provides endless material for various Christian groups to fight amongst themselves over what Jesus means when he describes himself as the bread of life, and that whole discussion, which I'll not be getting into that type of argument today, but it also includes the feeding of the 5,000. And I had read a book, reread a book recently that I discovered several years ago after hearing its author interviewed on Catholic radio on a show, Al Cresta in the afternoon, which I don't even know if that is still on, but it was a great show. He'd have really good interviews with authors and various people. I would listen to that on the way home from work. Now I work from home, so that's kind of fallen by the wayside, which is a shame because it's a good program, but I digress. Anyway, the author in the book, her name was Lydia McGrew, and the book that she was discussing, I think she's written a few books, maybe since then. The book she was discussing at that time was called Hidden in Plain View, and the subtitle, I think, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels in the Book of Acts. And it described these things that she called undesigned coincidences. And she was using this as an argument for the actual authorship of the Gospels by those apostles or those individuals to whom traditionally they were ascribed. So arguing for the legitimate authorship by Matthew of the Gospel according to Matthew, and of John for the Gospel according to John, etc. And an argument for the overall veracity of the gospel texts based on these things that she called undesigned coincidences. And just, it's a fascinating book, and I recommend it. It really caught my interest when I heard the interview. And to, I guess, simplify what the undesigned coincidence is, it is bits and pieces of the gospel accounts that are in separate gospels or in gospels and acts that explain each other, or one is used to explain the other, with no apparent coordination between the authors of the text, so that something that is left out of one account but is included in another account helps to explain something that is in one account but not in the other. That when you put the two together, it completes the story in a way that fits like a puzzle piece, that it makes sense. One example I'm going to go through just briefly here so I don't make this video tremendously long. Instead, I'm going to refer you, I'll make a link to a talk given by Miss McGrew that I found particularly interesting. She has several online that you can find, and certainly I recommend the book, and I'll probably place a link to that as well. But we are going to look at John chapter 6, and I'm using this lovely shiny Gideon Bible To do that, Luke chapter 6, the account of the feeding of the 5,000. Okay. Let's start it right at the beginning of chapter 6. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles, which he did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread, that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. And then it goes on from there in the familiar story of the feeding of the 5,000 men, plus women and children. So that is John's account of the beginning of that event. Why does John record, let me back up. Why does Jesus, as recorded in John's gospel, why does Jesus ask specifically Philip? Why does he mention Philip? Jesus then lifted up his eyes, saw a great company, etc., saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread? Philip, where can we buy bread? Why does Jesus single out Philip of the apostles here? Philip is kind of one of the invisible apostles that in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is only mentioned when there's a list of the apostles. You know, when it lists the disciples, the 12 disciples, his name is there, and he pretty much disappears after that. Not much information on Philip, the apostle Philip, in the other gospels. John has a few mentions of Philip, and this is one of them, where Jesus singles him out to ask him where they can buy bread. Now, and this was Lydia McGrew's argument. This is just one of the many, many examples in her book, but this is the one that came to mind today and caused me to want to make this little video about it. So, why would Jesus single out Philip here? Well, if we go to the beginning of the Gospel of John, chapter 1, the calling of Philip. This is one of the times Philip is mentioned, that in a way that he isn't in the other Gospels. The day following, Jesus would go forth into Galilee, and findeth Philip, and saith unto him, Follow me. Now Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip findeth Nathanael, and saith unto him, We have found him, of whom Moses and the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So, the important thing here, Philip was of Bethsaida. That's his hometown. Philip's from Bethsaida. Only John records that that's where Philip comes from. It's not mentioned in the other Gospels. In the story of the feeding of the 5,000, it does not mention where they are, only that they crossed the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias, went up on a mountain side, and the story begins that way. But if you look, and here's my gospel parallels. If you look here, the Gospel of, according to Luke, the same feeding of the 5,000. Sorry, I'm having a hard time reading with my poor glasses. I'll probably put screenshots so you can at least see what I'm talking about. When Luke reports the feeding of the 5,000, he doesn't just mention they went across the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, but it says, and he took them and withdrew apart to a city called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them in the kingdom of God, and cured those who had need of healing. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came and said, Send the crowd away to go into the villages and country round about, and lodge and get provisions, for we are here in a lonely place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves, etc., etc. No mention of Philip. He didn't single out Philip here. But here is where we learn they're in Bethsaida. Philip is from Bethsaida. We learn from the Gospel according to John. We also learn in the Gospel according to John that Jesus singled out Philip to say, "Where around here can we get some bread?" 2 pieces that fit together, tucked away in 2 separate Gospel accounts in a way that does not seem contrived. It doesn't seem like they coordinated their storytelling to, "I'll leave a hint here, John," and Luke saying to John, I'll write this in here if you promise to include this other part, and people, for thousands of years later will find this and they'll put it together and they'll figure out what we were trying to get at here. It's the undesigned coincidence. 2 pieces of a puzzle that fit together to explain an event in a way that you wouldn't have understood in its full context otherwise. So that's just one example, and one way in which a full parallel gospel would have been better here. I do have one of those, but it's a little harder to read, so I didn't bring this out. But here we have, this blue book I have is handy, but it's just the synoptics. It does not have John in this book, and that's why I was using 2 Bibles. But here we have a book that I've reviewed very early on in my channel, the System Bible Study, which is a terrific book and a gorgeous book, and I just love it. Came in many, many editions. This is, I believe, the first edition, and has lots and lots of helps, one of which is this parallel gospel. So this one has all 4 side by side, a little easier to compare, but it was a little harder to read, harder on the eyes, so I went with the bigger book. But there you go. That's how I would use a gospel parallel in that type of study, and I recommend that book by Lydia McGrew. Again, I'll put a link probably, I don't know if to Amazon, but I generally don't link to Amazon, but that's the easiest way, I guess, for people to find that book. And it's worth a read. I'll probably reread it again here soon just because it was fascinating to me. It may not be convincing to everyone, but it was convincing to me that all these layers of evidence hidden in plain view, as it were, do tend to bolster the case for the validity of the gospel accounts as written. So that's all I had to say about that. Maybe that was of interest to you. Maybe that sparked some thought. I'd like to hear what you think of that. If you're familiar with the concept or with that particular book, I'd like to hear that too. Thanks for watching this today. And as always, not sure exactly what I'll be doing next time, but I appreciate you stopping by, checking in, watching those things that are of interest to you, commenting. I wouldn't object if you click on things that involve liking or... no, I just can't bring myself to ask you to do these things, but you know how YouTube works. I appreciate you stopping by. Hope to see you here again next time.